I wonder if you've ever gotten a call on the telephone and you're talking to the person for a while and you don't really know who they are yet. You haven't recognized their voice, and yet they're talking to you as if they know you. And as you continue, you're not sure whether you should admit to them you don't know who they are, and yet you realize you're going to have to admit to them, who are you? And then you get to say, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize your voice. Well, this is my message for the second Sunday after Epiphany in 2021. And the pertinent readings for today are the 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 to 20, where little Samuel is spoken to by God. And the other reading, the gospel reading that's pertinent, is John chapter 1, verses 35 to 51, where Jesus' first disciples begin to recognize and understand who it is that they're talking to when they're talking to Jesus. So the next question for you to think about is, have you ever gotten a call from God? And I'm wondering right now how each one of you is answering this question in your own mind. And I'm guessing there might be quite a variety of responses. Some of you might say, oh, well, of course not. The only people these days who think that God is talking to them are mentally ill. I think it was the comedian Lily Tomlin who said, when I tell people that I talk to God in prayer all the time, they consider me to be a very devout person. But when I tell them that God talks to me all the time, that's when they think I'm schizophrenic. And so my second question is a little bit like the first, but perhaps even more to the point. If you ever did get a call from God, how would you be able to tell that it actually was God calling you? Now, when you ask some people the question, have you ever gotten a call from God? They might answer by saying, well, yes, the reason I'm in vocational ministry in the church is because through a process of discernment, it has been confirmed by those in authority that I have been called by God into vocational ministry. In Lutheran contexts, I've noticed that when a congregation invites a pastor to be their pastor, it's known as a call. Pastors recounting their experience will speak of receiving a call, meaning that a particular congregation has invited them to do pastoral work there. They don't usually specify that this is a call from God, but it seems to me that the ambiguity is intentional. I think because ideally the congregation in question is supposed to have been guided by the Holy Spirit, so that their invitation to that pastor is directed by God and indeed offered on behalf of God. Now, whether or not this ideal is reached in most every case, I would have to leave up to the cumulative testimony of Lutheran pastors and congregations. But I wonder if we have tended to use the concept of call and the terminology of vocation just a bit too narrowly. I'm going to start by admitting that I have no trouble accepting that on occasion, God still speaks to people in a manner not that different from the way he called and spoke to Samuel. But I do have a bit of a problem when the term vocation or calling is used only to speak of what we might call professional or ordained Christian ministry. When a person becomes a clergy person in the church and is ordained as a bishop or a priest or a deacon, we commonly call those vocations. But the unfortunate impression that this gives is that only those who choose or find a career in church are called, and the rest of the human race simply isn't called by God. But I believe every person is called by God, and even more specifically, apt to be called by Jesus. And so I think we have tended to use the concept of call and the terminology of vocation just a bit too narrowly. I was delighted when I learned that the Diocese of Coquel sponsors vocational discernment workshops that allow people to discern that their particular call and direction by God might include a great variety of projects or occupations or professions, and not just referring to work in institutional parts of the church. In our story today of the Lord speaking to Samuel is actually an example of being called by God, but not necessarily that call includes a commission or a commitment to a particular lifelong vocation or occupation. Of course, Samuel does go on to become a great transitional figure in Israel's history, the last of the judges and the great prophet who starts the monarchy. But in this, his initial encounter, even Samuel has to learn by trial and error how to recognize the voice of the Lord. And there are numerous other Bible stories where God's call provides instruction for a particular task or a short-term mission, not necessarily a call to a lifelong occupation. Indeed, it seems this was the case of the New Testament apostles Paul and Barnabas, who were already leaders in the church when the Lord said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." And then after fasting and praying, the people laid their hands on them and they sent them off. Now, Barnabas and Saul did not stay together forever. The mission task that the Lord called them to seems to have been just for a limited time. And I don't think either that we should limit the concept of vocation to a person's chosen profession or trade, career, or primary occupation. I say this because I do not think that the most significant aspect of God's call to any person is the particular trade or profession or focus of interest related to a particular kind of work. Although natural talents, inherent personal passions and personality combined with spiritual gifts may all be involved in the outworking of a person's calling and vocation. But I do not think that the most significant part of God's call on any person's life is whether they should be a plumber or a doctor or a biologist or a clergy person. Rather, I think the call and invitation and direction of God that is common to all of us is that we become channels of God's grace in whatever field or endeavor we find ourselves. The significant call of God on all our lives, no matter what profession or trade work we are in, is to be channels of God's grace wherever we are and whatever we do. I think the Lord calls us to accept our role as His witnesses, His representatives, and His agents in the world. And on some occasions, God may call us simply by prompting us to say or do some particular thing, no matter how small it may seem at the time. So instead of asking if you've ever had a call from God, perhaps I should be asking, what kind of call have you had from God? Is it possible that, like Samuel, we are still learning to recognize the voice of God in our lives? Several years ago, when I was preparing to preach on these lections, I was in conversation with a friend who was going through a very difficult time in his life, and he said that sometimes he wished he could just get an email from God telling him exactly what to do. And I don't think this is an uncommon human sentiment. When we're going through confusing times and we're faced with difficult decisions and we're not sure what to decide, we yearn sometimes to hear directly from the Lord. But I do think there are several warnings that we also need to consider if we're thinking this way. First, as we've already suggested, there's the possibility of being thought of as crazy. A related problem, as with Samuel, is that it may not at first be easy to recognize who it is that's speaking to us. One of the reasons claiming to hear from God is apt to be discounted by those around us is that there seem to be more people claiming to hear from God than actually are. And we sometimes forget that in the days of the great prophets Elijah and Jeremiah, there were far more false prophets than there were true prophets. The Apostle Paul said, Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. And Jesus said, Satan is a deceiver and the father of pseudo-truth. So let me ask you this. Have you ever heard of anyone believing something that isn't true? Now, in light of the news of this last year, I might be able to guess where your imaginations are going. But maybe we need to ask this of ourselves. have we ever believed something that wasn't true? I've really been enjoying the Nova Science documentaries about the planets. On almost every program, when the astronomers send out a probe to the far planets, they end up saying, the way we thought it was is not the way it's turning out to be. There's one other warning about hearing the voice of God, and it's contained in the story of the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. On that occasion, when God spoke, it frightened them so badly that they called for Moses to be their mediator. They said, you go listen to the Lord, Moses. It's too scary for us to hear the voice of God. And it is not just the sound that may be disagreeable to us. If you remember, the prophet Jonah heard from God, but he was so disinclined to obey that he fled in another direction. And then prophets like Jeremiah were faithful to listen to the Lord, but then they had to predict the collapse of their society, and they ended up being thrown in jail as traitors, or worse, because of it. And so, when little Samuel finally figures out what it is, in fact, that the Lord is saying to him, the main thing the Lord tells him is this dreadful prophecy about the doom and demise of the house of Eli the priest. Can you imagine, as a child, having to tell someone old enough to be your grandparent, who is basically your employer and your supervisor, that God has told you that they and their family are doomed because they have been such a bad parent? Wisdom suggests that our eagerness to hear directly from the Lord should be cautioned by the realization that not everything the Lord says may be nice and comforting. You may get prophetic words that are difficult to receive and deliver. Hearing the voice of God or getting a word from the Lord may be considerably more than we expect or want. So what is the answer then to wanting to hear from God or wanting to get a call from God? Is it just too dangerous? Are we better off not knowing the voice of God? I think the gospel account is helpful here. The New Testament approach to enlightenment is not just an individual private experience, something that you might get by years of sitting in silent meditation emptying your mind, or something you hear that other spirit-filled seekers are not hearing at all. Rather, the New Testament approach to enlightenment is more along the lines of what I call the Andrew and Philip phenomenon. As soon as Andrew and Philip discovered Jesus as a candidate for being the Messiah, they each went and told others and invited those others to come and see. They were already doing what Jesus would say of them later when he said, "You will be my witnesses." Andrew went and told his brother Shimon, who became Peter, and Philip went and told Nathanael. Now we do notice that Nathanael did have a very personal encounter and experience with Jesus that confirmed his acceptance of Jesus as the Messiah. But the recognition of Jesus by Andrew, Peter, Philip, and Nathanael was therefore both a corporate and an individual experience. Jesus didn't just go around touching people and saying, "Now you're connected directly with God. Now you are spiritually enlightened and connected to God. You have arrived." Rather, Jesus called his followers into a company, into a community, and he told them, "Together you will be my witnesses. Together you will now be the disciple makers. As a team you will take my gospel to the ends of the earth." And, as it turned out, it was that company of the Lord's witnesses that recorded the voice of the Spirit in what was to become the Bible. The record of God's calls to his people are recorded there for all of us to hear. Have you ever wondered why in our story of Samuel it starts by saying, "The word of the Lord was rare in those days, visions were not widespread"? Well, go back to the phone call analogy again. Have you ever been in a phone conversation talking to another person, and then after a while, in the middle of what you're saying, you realize that they've hung up and they're not really listening to you anymore? do you tend to keep on talking, or do you just tend to feel a little bit silly and hang up as well? The point is that if no one is listening, what's the point of continuing to speak? Do you think that God might feel that way sometimes? Well, one of the blessings of writing letters or email is that the person you are writing to doesn't need to be listening at the exact same time that you are putting your thoughts into words. Can you guess what I'm getting at? We no longer need to wonder why God is not vocalizing much anymore. God has already said enough in the Scriptures, which are like a long love letter or email written to the whole human race. And the Lord still speaks through that email to everyone who will listen. There is enough in the Scriptures to reveal the mission of God in the world and invite us into the Lord's project of redemption. Yes, I believe the Lord can still call and speak to individuals just as he called and spoke to Samuel. But God's primary calls to the world have been delegated to his people and embedded in the Scriptures. And for those of us who have ears to hear, we will see Jesus as the fulfillment of Jacob's ladder and the one who connects heaven and earth. And as we take up the mantle of Andrew and Philip, we also will say to our friends and our families and our neighbors, we have found him about whom Moses and the law and also the prophets wrote. We have found the Messiah. Come and see. God bless you.